Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In the quietest corners of modern history, there's a number so large it feels almost impossible to hold in the mind. 40 to 77 million lives lost in a nation at peace. No battles, no foreign armies, no flames rolling across borders, only policies, campaigns, and a machinery of fear that turned everyday life into something perilous. Across China, entire generations disappeared without monuments, without graves, without the world noticing. Their absence hangs like a shadow over the century. Most of them never saw a battlefield. They were farmers who starved in their own villages, teachers humiliated by their students, workers sent to labor camps for a sentence they never heard, children who whispered the wrong question, families who locked their doors not to keep danger out, but to keep a stray word from slipping into the night. Their suffering unfolded quietly, inside homes, classrooms, fields, and offices, woven into the routines of ordinary life. What makes this tragedy haunting is not only its scale, but its intimacy. Terror was not an event, it was a condition of living. It shaped the way people spoke, how they sat during meetings, how they breathed when a cadre passed by. It lived in glances, in silences, in the careful calm of a family dinner where no one dared mention the things they all knew but could never say. In Mao's China, survival often meant learning how to erase parts of yourself. For nearly 3 decades, the line between loyalty and danger shifted without warning. A word once celebrated could, years later, become fatal. A family once praised could be dragged into the street for public judgment, and a leader once hailed for liberation could become the architect of one of the most devastating peacetime catastrophes in human history. This is the story of how a revolution born from hope built an empire of fear, how ideology became law, how silence became safety, and how millions were swept into the currents of a system that believed enemies were everywhere, even in the minds of the people it ruled. And to understand how this world was constructed, we must begin at its foundation, with the ideas that turned fear into doctrine and doctrine into destiny. When Mao Zedong proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China in 1949, millions believed they were witnessing the end of chaos. After decades of warlordism, Japanese invasion, and civil war, China seemed finally united under a single banner. But behind the celebrations, Mao held a conviction far more severe than the promises of liberation. He believed that class enemies did not disappear with victory, they only hid deeper. To Mao, the triumph of the Communist Party was not the endpoint of revolution, but merely its opening chapter. He argued that enemies survived in the shadows, in the minds of former landlords, in the habits of intellectuals, in the instincts of party cadres who might one day drift toward bourgeois thought. Even those who supported the revolution could, in a moment of ideological weakness, become threats to it. This idea, revolution as something permanent, gave Mao moral license to keep society in a constant state of alert. From the very beginning, fear became a governing principle. Mao portrayed Chinese society as a battlefield where invisible enemies lurked, waiting for their chance to sabotage the new order. In his speeches, he warned that counter-revolutionaries hid inside the people, masked as neighbors, colleagues, and even family. This worldview made trust dangerous, suspicion patriotic, and vigilance a form of loyalty. It was not enough to defeat political rivals. Mao insisted that their influence lingered in the attitudes, memories, and thoughts of ordinary people. So the party's mission expanded beyond transforming institutions. It aimed to reshape minds. Ideological study sessions, confessions, and mass mobilizations were presented as tools of purification. The revolution had to penetrate every village, every workplace, every private fear. This climate of ideological tension was reinforced by Mao's belief in the redemptive power of violence. He admired how struggle and bloodshed had forged the communist movement. In his writings, he claimed that revolution was not a dinner party, but a process that demanded boldness, confrontation, and sacrifice. These principles laid the groundwork for a system in which terror was not a temporary measure, but a structural necessity. By the early 1950s, the promise of liberation had transformed into something sharper. Ordinary people quickly learned that the boundaries of safety were unstable, shifting with party directives and political winds. A wrong word, an old affiliation, Even a family background could become a mark of suspicion. These early years did not yet carry the full scale of repression to come, but they introduced the logic behind it. Thus, as China entered the new era Mao had promised, the stage was already set for decades of upheaval. The revolution had won, but in Mao's mind, victory demanded vigilance, vigilance demanded enemies, and enemies demanded struggle. In this way, the foundations of a vast political terror machine were laid long before anyone realized how deeply it would penetrate the lives of millions. In Mao's political imagination, revolution could never be allowed to rest. He believed that even after the Communist Party seized power, the underlying class struggle continued beneath the surface of society. If the revolution stopped, he warned, enemies would regroup, corrupt the party, and drag China back into exploitation. This fear, part ideological, part personal, became the justification for unending vigilance and constant political campaigns. Mao insisted that counter-revolutionaries existed in two forms: those who were visible and those who were hidden. Visible enemies, landlords, rich peasants, former nationalist soldiers, religious organizations, could be identified and punished. But hidden enemies were far more dangerous. They lived inside thought itself, in hesitation, doubt, or any instinct that diverged from the party's ideological line. Such thinking made even innocent citizens vulnerable to sudden accusation. This doctrine transformed politics into a form of psychological warfare. If the enemy could live inside anyone, then every person became both suspect and enforcer. Class struggle, Mao declared, must be waged every day. He meant it literally. By framing political loyalty as an ongoing battle against unseen forces, Mao preserved the emotional momentum of wartime and redirected it into daily life under socialism. The party absorbed this worldview and molded society around it. Workers were told that bourgeois ideology seeped into factories like a contaminant. Students learned that thoughts misaligned with Maoism signaled a collapse of revolutionary discipline. Cadres were reminded that success could breed arrogance, and arrogance could become counter-revolutionary. In such an environment, deviation was not an act, it was a diagnosis. This perpetual hunt for ideological purity created a culture where citizens monitored themselves more harshly than any police force ever could. People developed the instinct to measure their words, rehearse their expressions, and erase private doubts before they surfaced. Silence became a form of survival. Conformity became a shield. Under Maoism, internal caution was more effective than external repression because it rewired emotional reflexes themselves. The doctrine also empowered Mao to launch political campaigns whenever he felt the need to reassert control. Because enemies were assumed to be ever-present, every purge could be framed as a necessary cleansing. Every wave of repression against intellectuals, cadres, peasants, or even fellow revolutionaries was justified by the premise that the nation was constantly at risk. Terror flowed naturally from the ideology, not as a mistake, but as a logical outcome of the system. Thus, the foundation of Maoist terror was not just the machinery of state power, it was the belief that no society could ever be safe. Peace was an illusion, coexistence a trap, and stability a sign of ideological decay. With these principles embedded into the governing philosophy of the new China, the stage was set for decades of purges, upheavals, and engineered fear. And it would not take long for violence, ritualized and public, to become the instrument that brought Mao's doctrine to life. For Mao, violence was not simply a harsh necessity. It was the heartbeat of the revolution. He believed that transformation required struggle, and struggle required confrontation. Political enemies, real or imagined, were not to be debated with or persuaded. They were to be exposed, humiliated, and destroyed both symbolically and physically in the name of revolutionary renewal. Struggle sessions became one of the earliest and most recognizable instruments of this violence. These spectacles were staged in factories, schools, villages, and public squares. Victims, teachers, landlords, clerks, or sometimes ordinary people caught in personal vendettas were dragged before crowds, forced to kneel, insulted, beaten, and coerced into confessing crimes that often never existed. The point was not truth, it was theater, a ritual of dominance that bound communities to Maoist ideology through shared participation in pain. Executions followed similar logic. Many were carried out publicly, with thousands of villagers or city residents assembled to witness the state's power. Children were brought to watch, told that witnessing violence would harden their revolutionary spirit. In some regions, quotas encouraged local officials to kill a minimum number of counter-revolutionaries, creating perverse incentives for towns to invent enemies when none could be found. What made these acts so effective was how they rewired social norms. Violence no longer carried stigma. It became a patriotic act, a demonstration of loyalty to the state. Participation in struggle sessions or denunciations signaled one's commitment to the revolution. Refusing to join, or even watching with discomfort, could mark someone as ideologically suspect. Violence became a test, and ordinary people learned quickly that staying silent was dangerous. This new political culture spread rapidly because it tapped into existing tensions. Personal grievances, jealousy, and local rivalries were masked beneath the language of class struggle. A villager angry at a neighbor could accuse him of hoarding grain or harboring nationalist sympathies. A worker competing for promotion might denounce a colleague as rightist. Mao's ideology provided the perfect cover for settling old scores under the guise of revolutionary fervor. The psychological impact was profound. Fear and shame seeped into daily life. No one could predict when they might be called to perform, accuse, or confess. The sight of beaten bodies and forced apologies became part of the social landscape. Over time, repeated exposure numbed communities, making escalating violence easier to enact and harder to resist. In the absence of legal safeguards, the boundary between justice and vengeance dissolved completely. Through these rituals, Maoist China learned to fuse ideology with brutality. By turning violence into a shared social experience, the party ensured that responsibility and guilt was collective. Entire villages, schools, and factories became complicit in acts of cruelty they once would have found unthinkable. And with every public beating, every shouted accusation, the machinery of terror strengthened its grip. In the first decade of communist rule, Mao's image began to appear everywhere, on walls, school books, factory gates, and village meeting halls. At first, the portraits were symbols of victory, reminders of a leader who had unified the nation after decades of turmoil. But as the years passed, the images multiplied, larger and more imposing, until Mao seemed to watch citizens from every public space. His presence became constant, transforming from political leadership into something closer to sacred authority. The party's propaganda machine reinforced this transformation with relentless discipline. Newspapers printed Mao's quotations on the front page every morning, presented not as ideas but as universal truths. Slogans glorifying the chairman were painted on walls and shouted in parades, becoming part of the rhythm of daily life. Children memorized passages from the Little Red Book, reciting them with the same reverence once reserved for Confucian texts or religious scripture. This saturation made Mao's voice the only legitimate guide in public discourse. His sayings were invoked to justify policies, settle disputes, and judge moral behavior. Bureaucrats learned that quoting Mao could shield them from accountability, while questioning him, even indirectly, risked immediate suspicion. Over time, the line between genuine belief and self-preservation blurred as people adopted Maoist language instinctively, repeating it to survive. The cult also reshaped social rituals. Political meetings opened with chants praising Mao. Work units began the day by studying his writings. Families displayed his portrait beside ancestral altars. Weddings, funerals, and local festivals were infused with revolutionary slogans. The personal was made political, and the political was made sacred. Mao no longer appeared as a fallible human being, but as the embodiment of truth, history, and destiny. This deification allowed Mao to transcend accountability. When policies failed or disasters struck, blame did not fall on the chairman. It fell on those who misinterpreted him. During the Great Leap Forward, when famine ravaged the countryside, officials insisted Mao's ideas were flawless. The problem lay in insufficient loyalty or distorted implementation. His infallibility became a mechanism that insulated him from consequences even as millions suffered. Fear, admiration and dependence fused into one emotional landscape. Citizens learned to express gratitude for Mao's guidance even when they were starving or suffering beatings in struggle sessions. Survival demanded displays of devotion, and devotion became indistinguishable from belief. In this atmosphere, loyalty ceased to be a political choice. It became a condition of existence. By the early 1960s, Mao had become more than a revolutionary leader. He was a mythic figure, a living oracle whose words shaped reality itself. With such a foundation in place, the next waves of political purges could unfold with terrifying force. When Mao commanded the nation to struggle, few dared question him, not because they agreed, but because questioning him meant stepping outside the only moral universe the party allowed. Beneath the surface of Mao's ideological vision lay a vast, meticulously engineered apparatus designed to penetrate every corner of Chinese life. The Communist Party did not merely govern the state, it inhabited it. Party committees appeared in every school, factory, village, and military unit, ensuring that no decision, down to the distribution of fertilizer or the admissions list of a rural middle school, could escape political scrutiny. Loyalty was enforced not only from above, but horizontally across workplaces and communities, creating a system where vigilance became communal duty. The state bureaucracy served as the operational arm of this political order. Local people's committees and revolutionary committees implemented directives, organized mass meetings, administered struggle sessions, and created files on millions of citizens. These bodies had both administrative authority and ideological power, turning seemingly mundane tasks, grain quotas, student placements, housing assignments, into acts of political judgment. In this structure, governance was inseparable from discipline. Alongside them stood the Public Security Bureau, the all-seeing police force of Maoist China. Its officers monitored ideology, arrested suspects, and maintained a sprawling network of informants embedded in workplaces and neighborhoods. The household registration system, hukou, restricted movement and locked entire families to their places of birth, preventing the flow of people who might otherwise escape political targeting. Through surveillance, documentation, and quiet intimidation, the PSB became the invisible skeleton of Mao's control. The People's Liberation Army, meanwhile, was more than a military force. It was the party's ultimate guarantor. The PLA built roads, oversaw factories, ran local governments during moments of crisis, and intervened directly in internal purges. Soldiers were trained not only to fight wars, but to enforce ideological discipline within the population. When political chaos erupted during the Cultural Revolution, it was the PLA that restored order, often violently, under Mao's command. These four pillars fused to create a system where political life and daily existence merged into a single, indivisible hierarchy. The party dictated ideology, the state enforced it, the police watched for deviation, and the army crushed resistance when needed. No part of society stood outside this web. Even private life was porous, monitored indirectly through neighbors, co-workers, and committees. Fear was not just top-down. It radiated through networks of ordinary people conditioned to report suspicious behavior. Together, these institutions formed a machine that was both rigid and fluid. Rigid in its hierarchy and demand for obedience, yet fluid in its ability to mobilize millions on command. When Mao launched a purge, the apparatus moved swiftly. Files were opened, political labels updated, and entire communities thrust into struggle. The terror did not rely on isolated acts, but on a system capable of turning ideology into action with devastating speed. This structure ensured that when the next waves of political campaigns arrived, campaigns of accusation, eradication, and suffering, they would not feel like external shocks. They would feel like the continuation of a system designed from the beginning to regulate thought, behavior, and even emotion. The machinery was already humming. All it needed was Mao's signal to unleash its next transformation. One of the most chilling instruments of Maoist control was something deceptively mundane, a file. Known as the Dangan, the political dossier followed every citizen from youth to old age, recording their class background, family history, work performance, political reliability, and even whispered criticisms. These files were not mere paperwork. They were political lifelines determining whether a person could enter university, gain a promotion, move to a city, or marry someone from a more reliable background. In a system where ideology shaped destiny, The dossier became the state's memory, and no one could escape its gaze. Every entry in the dossier carried weight. A comment from a supervisor might praise diligence, yet hint at insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm, setting off alarms decades later. A distant relative who once worked for the Kuomintang could permanently stain an entire family line. Even the rumors of neighbors offered freely during struggle sessions or political meetings were recorded as reference materials. Tars. In Maoist China, reputation was not something earned. It was something assigned, accumulated, and weaponized. Citizens learned to live with the dossier as if it were a second shadow, always trailing behind them, yet invisible to their own eyes. They were never allowed to read it, never permitted to correct errors, and rarely informed when new accusations or comments were added. The uncertainty created a state of perpetual self-policing. People made decisions not based on personal desire, but on how those choices might be interpreted by unseen authorities. Fear was internalized, shaping behavior long before any punishment was delivered. The dossier's influence extended into the most intimate decisions of life. Young people considering marriage worried not only about romance, but about whether their partner's background would contaminate their own political standing. Job assignments depended more on political lineage than skill. A talented engineer from a landlord family could be sent to hard labor, while a mediocre cadre's son advanced effortlessly. The Dangan ensured that social mobility was chained to ideological purity. The system also created a culture of quiet opportunism. A well-placed accusation could destroy a rival's prospects, opening the way for one's own advancement. During political campaigns, people denounced colleagues or even relatives to avoid being labeled soft or complicit. The dossier turned ordinary relationships into fragile alliances, where trust was dangerous and silence was a survival skill. For party officials, the dossiers were both a tool and a burden. They were expected to update, classify, and store millions of files, maintaining a detailed political biography for each citizen. The bureaucracy became a fortress of paper, with entire offices dedicated to sorting and evaluating the personal histories of the populace. Yet this administrative machinery created a powerful illusion. The state appeared omniscient, aware of every detail, even when much of its information came from rumor. By binding every individual to a lifetime of surveillance, the Dangan system achieved something more profound than open terror. It turned fear into habit. People learned to censor their thoughts, mask their emotions, and shape their identities to fit the political categories assigned to them. In Maoist China, the state did not need to watch everyone at every moment. The dossier ensured that everyone watched themselves. From the earliest days of the People's Republic, Mao's government divided the population into rigid political categories. Every citizen was sorted into a class component that determined whether their bloodline was red, loyal, revolutionary, and trustworthy, or black, meaning tainted by ties to landlords, rich peasants, capitalists, religious leaders, or former nationalists. This was not merely social labeling, it was a political caste system, one that touched every aspect of life. Children inherited their parents' class status like an unchangeable genetic code. Red bloodlines were celebrated as the backbone of the new China. Workers, poor peasants, revolutionary martyrs, and party cadres were held up as models of purity. Their children were presumed ideologically sound, deserving of better schooling, trusted by officials, and favored for future positions. Even mistakes or minor offenses were often forgiven because their background provided a shield, a moral buffer against political suspicion. Black bloodlines, by contrast, condemned families for generations. A person born into a landlord or capitalist family could be punished for events that happened before their birth. Opportunities closed one after another. Universities rejected them. Factories relegated them to the lowest jobs, and villages denied them leadership roles. When political campaigns intensified, those with black backgrounds were the first to be targeted, regardless of their personal character or loyalty. This hereditary system of political worth rewired social dynamics at the deepest level. Parents whispered warnings to their children about friendships that might stain their dossiers. Young people weighed love against survival, fearing a marriage that would connect them to a politically dirty lineage. Children learned to hide their origins the way others hid illnesses or debts, knowing that exposure could follow them throughout life. The personal became inseparable from the political. During mass campaigns, these divisions hardened further. Red bloodline youths were encouraged to view themselves as natural heirs of the revolution, destined to lead and entitled to enforce ideological purity. Those from black families lived in constant dread of denunciation. A single argument, a jealous classmate, or a rumor could lead to humiliation, beatings, or exile. Political identity had become a matter of birth, not belief. The system also created perverse incentives. Some families fabricated stories to distance themselves from black backgrounds, rewriting personal histories to appear more revolutionary. Others denounced relatives to prove loyalty. In this environment, truth lost meaning. Survival depended on fitting into the narrative that the party defined as righteous. Historical identity became a weapon, wielded by those who understood how to navigate Mao's political tides. By dividing society into fixed categories of worth, the party ensured that fear flowed downward and resentment flowed upward. Red bloodlines became guardians of ideology, while black bloodlines became perpetual targets. This hereditary politics turned millions of innocent people into suspects before they ever spoke a word, and it conditioned an entire generation to see class origin not as a social fact, but as moral destiny. The new government did not wait long before unleashing its first major purge. Between 1950 and 1953, Mao ordered the suppression of counter-revolutionaries, a campaign meant to eliminate remnants of the old society. But in practice, it became a nationwide hunt for enemies both real and imagined. Local officials were given quotas, demanding that each county and village identify, arrest, and execute a certain number of counter-revolutionaries. The numbers were arbitrary, but the message was unmistakable. Killing was now a metric of political loyalty. Public rallies became the stage upon which these purges unfolded. Tens of thousands gathered in town squares to watch accused individuals, former Kuomintang officers, landlords, religious figures, or simply those who had attracted suspicion, confess their crimes under duress. Loudspeakers amplified the verdicts, and when the moment came, gunshots echoed across fields, rivers, and village walls. For many spectators, this was their first encounter with state-sanctioned killing, and the shock quickly blurred into resignation. The campaign spread rapidly into rural China, where the party used the violence to reshape local power structures. Landlords who had dominated village life for generations were denounced, humiliated, beaten, and executed. Their families were forced to kneel before neighbors who had once deferred to them, reversing the social order overnight. Land reform followed, redistributing property but also embedding cycles of revenge, resentment, and deep generational scars. Fear suffused the countryside. People confronted the terrifying realization that guilt no longer depended on actions, but on labels imposed by the party. Some were executed for minor associations with the old regime, others for personal conflicts repackaged as political crimes. Villagers accused each other not only out of ideology, but out of desperation, jealousy, or simple survival. In many places, resistance was impossible. Those who protested were themselves branded enemies. Urban areas fared no better. Professional associations, religious communities, and former business owners were targeted en masse. The police, empowered by Mao's directives, conducted swift arrests and interrogations. Confessions extracted through beatings or threats filled the political dossiers of millions. In factories and offices, workers learned that one careless word could lead to a knock on the door at midnight. Silence became the safest response to everything. Researchers estimate that 700,000 to more than 2 million people were executed during the campaign, while another 2 to 3 million were imprisoned or sent to early forms of labor camps, where many perished from hunger or abuse. These killings were not the result of chaos or misunderstanding. They were intentionally engineered to train the population in obedience. Mao understood that terror was most effective when it was public, unpredictable, and collective. By 1953, the message was deeply internalized. The revolution could take your life at any moment, and questioning it was indistinguishable from suicide. The suppression of counter-revolutionaries was the first great turning point, the moment when Mao's ideological vision fully fused with violence. It taught a nation that power now flowed through fear, and it prepared both the people and the party for even larger waves of repression yet to come. Even as the countryside reeled from executions and land reform violence, Mao shifted his focus to China's cities. In 1951, he launched the Three Anti-Campaign, ostensibly targeting corruption, waste, and bureaucratic misconduct among party cadres. But the campaign was not designed simply to expose wrongdoing. It was meant to terrify the bureaucracy into absolute obedience. Cadres were interrogated, forced to confess publicly, and pressured to denounce colleagues in order to prove loyalty. Confession became a ritual of political purification. Many officials, terrified of being labeled insufficiently revolutionary, exaggerated their own faults or invented wrongdoing to match the severity expected by superiors. Entire offices dissolved into cycles of accusation and self-criticism, with workers competing to display fervor in rooting out enemies within. Purging. What began as an anti-corruption movement quickly transformed into a purge of the party's own ranks, instilling paralysis and fear among those tasked with running the state. The following year, Mao expanded the assault to include the urban business class. The Five Anti-Campaign targeted capitalists accused of bribery, tax evasion, fraud, and economic sabotage. Investigators stormed into offices, factories, and homes, collecting confessions with threats, humiliation, and round-the-clock interrogations. The campaign framed private enterprise as inherently counter-revolutionary, a remnant of the old society that had to be crushed for socialism to advance. For many business owners, the psychological pressure was unbearable. Posters listing crimes were plastered on their doors. Neighbors monitored their behavior. Workers denounced them at mass meetings. Some were ordered to pay enormous fines far beyond their means, effectively bankrupting them. Suicide surged across major cities as business people saw no path forward except death, often leaping from rooftops or hanging themselves in their offices. In Shanghai alone, the waves of suicide reached tragic proportions. The destruction of the bourgeoisie went beyond individual suffering. Entire networks of skilled managers, accountants, traders, and entrepreneurs disappeared almost overnight. Their businesses were seized or forced into joint ventures dominated by the state. As the private sector collapsed, China's urban economy lost expertise and flexibility, becoming increasingly centralized and politicized. Efficiency gave way to ideological conformity. These campaigns also deepened social fragmentation. Workers were encouraged to turn against bosses, colleagues, and even family members to protect themselves from suspicion. A vocabulary of hostility entered daily life. Words like parasite, exploiter, and enemy of the people became common insults. The campaigns legitimized envy and resentment, weaponizing them for political ends. By the end of 1952, Mao had achieved two objectives. He had shattered any independent economic class that might challenge the party, and he had terrorized the bureaucracy into submission. The Three Anti and Five Anti campaigns showed how quickly Mao could mobilize the masses against targeted groups, transforming cities into arenas of political theater. And, as with earlier purges, these campaigns demonstrated that terror was not an exception, but a governing method, setting the stage for even more catastrophic policies to come. In the mid-1950s, after years of purges and consolidation, Mao faced growing frustration within the party. Bureaucrats complained quietly about inefficiency. Intellectuals worried openly about rigid dogmatism. Sensing these tensions and eager to reaffirm his dominance, Mao announced a surprising new initiative, the 100 Flowers movement, urging citizens to let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. The message appeared to signal a rare opening in political life, an invitation to speak freely without fear. At first, people hesitated. Years of repression had taught them that honest criticism was dangerous. But Mao repeated the call, promising that criticism is not a crime. Gradually, professors, students, writers, and even some party members stepped forward. They criticized corruption, arbitrary arrests, censorship, and the absence of genuine debate. Letters surged into government offices. Newspapers published cautious essays. University walls filled with posters challenging the party's direction. For a brief moment, it felt as though China was entering a new era. Intellectuals debated philosophical questions, workers demanded improvements in administration, and cadres called for better accountability. The atmosphere in major cities shifted from fear to tentative hope. It was one of the only periods in Maoist history when public discourse approached openness. But beneath the surface, Mao watched with growing irritation and perhaps satisfaction as critics revealed the depth of resentment within society. Then the trap snapped shut. In June 1957, Mao abruptly accused these critics of harboring counter-revolutionary intentions. He claimed they had used free speech to attack the party and undermine socialism. The Hundred Flowers movement was rebranded as evidence of an internal conspiracy. Within weeks, China descended into another purge, one far broader and more devastating than the criticism it claimed to punish. The anti-rightist campaign began in full force. More than 550,000 people were labeled rightists and subjected to re-education, exile, or imprisonment. Intellectuals were sent to remote labor camps in Gansu, Heilongjiang, and Xinjiang, where many died from starvation, disease, and overwork. Teachers were forced to kneel before their students. Scholars recanted their life's work. Entire generations of China's brightest thinkers were silenced. What had begun as a promise of openness turned into a calculated mechanism of entrapment. Families suffered lasting consequences. A rightist label placed on a parent condemned children to decades of discrimination, barring them from universities or desirable jobs. Neighbors distanced themselves from accused families to avoid guilt by association. In work units across the country, fear spread once again as people realized how easily a moment of honesty could destroy their future. China's fragile intellectual class was shattered, leaving a void that would cripple scientific, educational, and cultural development for decades. The Hundred Flowers trap demonstrated Mao's mastery of psychological manipulation. By inviting criticism and then punishing it brutally, he exposed dissenters, isolated moderates, and reminded the party that loyalty must always exceed truth. This purge was not merely about silencing intellectuals. It was about reaffirming Mao's unchallenged authority before launching his next and most catastrophic campaign. With the nation's thinkers broken and its administrators terrified, Mao was free to impose policies on a scale no one dared question. By the late 1950s, Mao believed China stood on the brink of a historic transformation. He envisioned a breathtaking leap from agrarian poverty to industrial might, one so rapid that it would shock the world and elevate China above the West. This vision became the Great Leap Forward, a campaign that combined utopian ambition with ideological fervor. Mao declared that with enough revolutionary enthusiasm, mountains could be moved, steel could be conjured from village furnaces, and agriculture could be doubled in a single harvest. The countryside became the laboratory for these fantasies. Small family farms were abolished overnight and replaced with vast people's communes, each containing thousands of residents who ate, worked, and slept under collective authority. Private cooking was banned. Communal dining halls served as symbols of socialist abundance. Families surrendered tools, livestock, and grain to the collective, told that personal ownership was a relic of the old world. For many, daily life lost all privacy and autonomy. Meanwhile, Mao demanded that China's steel production match Britain's within a few years. Villages responded with zeal, melting pots, pans, door hinges, and farming equipment in backyard furnaces to meet impossible quotas. Smoke rose across the countryside as furnaces glowed through the night, giving the illusion of a nation forging its future with its bare hands. But the metal produced was useless scrap, brittle, impure, and worthless. Still, officials celebrated the results, fearing punishment if they told the truth. Lying became a survival skill. Local cadres inflated grain production figures to impress superiors, who inflated them further for provincial meetings, until the reports reached Beijing as fantastical numbers. Mao, satisfied with the apparent success, ordered massive grain requisitions based on these fabrications. Grain was extracted from villages already struggling to feed themselves, then shipped to cities or exported abroad to prove China's strength. The new agricultural methods, dictated by ideology rather than science, worsened the crisis. Deep plowing, close planting, and other untested theories destroyed soil and reduced yields. Peasants watched helplessly as crops withered, knowing that reporting failure would brand them as saboteurs. In many communes, fields lay barren by the end of the season, yet officials insisted that bumper harvests had been achieved. The truth was buried under layers of fear and propaganda. Despite mounting signs of catastrophe, local officials continued to perform rituals of abundance. Communes staged feasts for visiting party leaders, displaying grain borrowed or stolen from other villages. Dancers performed in fields to celebrate imaginary harvests. Photographers captured images of overflowing granaries, granaries that were often empty or filled with husks. These illusions reassured Mao that the Great Leap was succeeding, obscuring the suffering already taking hold in the countryside. By the winter of 1959, cracks began to show, but the machinery of enthusiasm could not be reversed. Mao dismissed warnings from moderate leaders like Peng Dehuai, accusing them of betrayal and capitalist thinking. The campaign pushed forward with even greater intensity, consuming whatever remained of the rural economy. In villages across China, hunger spread quietly at first, then violently, as grain supplies failed and people faced starvation. Thus, the Great Leap Forward, launched to propel China into a new era, had already begun its descent into the deadliest policy-driven disaster in human history. The next phase would reveal the full scope of the devastation, as ideology collided with reality and tens of millions paid the price for a dream that could not be questioned. By the early 1960s, the countryside had become a landscape of quiet desperation. Commune canteens, once advertised as symbols of abundance, now served thin gruel or nothing at all. Families wandered the same fields where they had once worked proudly, searching for grains dropped in the dirt, insects hidden under rocks, or bark that could be boiled into something vaguely edible. Hunger no longer felt like a temporary hardship. It became an inescapable weight pressing upon every movement, every thought, every attempt to survive. Even as starvation spread, the state continued to requisition grain based on falsified harvest reports. Local officials, terrified of appearing disloyal, surrendered whatever remained in granaries, leaving communes stripped of their last reserves. When desperate villagers pleaded for relief, they were accused of hoarding or sabotage. Any complaint, even whispered in private, could be interpreted as counter-revolutionary defiance. In many regions, the fear of political punishment was stronger than the instinct to save one's own life. Entire villages descended into silence. People no longer spoke during meetings, too weak to shout slogans or clap for visiting cadres. Bodies grew skeletal as the months passed, and disease swept through populations already pushed to their limits. Some communes locked their gates to prevent starving peasants from leaving, believing that letting them roam would draw unwanted attention from higher authorities. Hunger spread in sealed pockets, turning villages into open-air prisons. Acts of cruelty and desperation emerged side by side. In some provinces, guards beat or tortured those accused of stealing state grain, even when the grain in question had been intended for the commune's own children. Families tore apart over scraps of food. Elders sacrificed meals for younger generations who ultimately could not be saved. In the darkest corners of the famine, reports surfaced of cannibalism, not born of savagery, but of a population driven beyond the limits of human endurance. Yet the state refused to acknowledge the catastrophe. Propaganda continued to trumpet record harvests and socialist triumphs. Newspapers celebrated imaginary successes, praising communes that had long since starved. Mao's authority remained untouchable, insulated by layers of loyal cadres terrified to deliver honest reports. As millions died, official speeches spoke only of progress and revolutionary will. Meanwhile, internal government documents, later uncovered by scholars, show that leaders knew far more about the crisis than they admitted publicly. Some provincial officials begged Beijing to reduce grain quotas, but were accused of spreading pessimism. Others concealed the truth entirely, hoping to survive the political consequences. In such an environment, the famine could not be stopped. The machinery of ideology had overridden the capacity for mercy. Estimates of the death toll range from 30 to 45 million, making the Great Leap Forward the deadliest famine in recorded human history. The vast majority of victims were peasants who had no voice, no protection, and no choice in the policies imposed upon them. They died anonymously in fields, in their homes, along roadsides, or inside commune buildings, leaving behind villages that would never fully recover. By the time the famine subsided around 1962, China was exhausted, traumatized, and hollowed out. But instead of reflection or accountability, the catastrophe was buried under silence. No memorials were built, no public mourning permitted, and no leaders held responsible. The nation emerged physically weakened, yet politically primed for the next wave of upheaval, one that Mao would unleash with even greater force in the years to come. The Great Leap Forward left Mao's prestige shaken, even inside the party he had built. Millions had died, agricultural production collapsed, and China's economy teetered on the edge of ruin. In quiet meetings behind closed doors, senior leaders criticized his policies, some cautiously, others with deep concern. Mao, sensing that his authority was slipping, withdrew from daily governance, allowing moderates like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping to repair the damage. But retreat was not surrender. Mao was waiting, watching, and planning his return. Throughout the early 1960s, Mao cultivated a narrative that he had been sabotaged by capitalist roaders within the party. These were not foreign spies or former landlords. They were his own comrades who had supposedly betrayed the revolutionary spirit by prioritizing economic recovery over ideology. Mao believed that bureaucratic caution had strangled the revolutionary flame. He framed himself as the guardian of purity, a lone visionary surrounded by those who misunderstood the revolution's true purpose. This narrative became the spark for a new political storm. By 1966, Mao decided to regain control not by persuading party elites, but by bypassing them entirely. He would mobilize the force he trusted most, China's youth. Angry, idealistic, and raised on a diet of revolutionary propaganda, millions of students idolized Mao as the embodiment of truth. Mao's writings filled their textbooks, his image hung in their classrooms, and his call for continuous revolution echoed through their lessons. They were ready to act with the fervor of true believers. The Cultural Revolution began quietly, with purges at Beijing University and attacks on professors labeled as poisonous weeds. Posters criticizing teachers appeared overnight, written in bold characters by students emboldened by Mao's encouragement. But soon the movement expanded beyond campuses, spreading through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and political meetings. Mao declared that China was on the brink of a new struggle, one to root out hidden enemies inside the party itself. The message electrified the country. Then came Mao's dramatic re-entry onto the national stage. In July 1966, he swam across the Yangtze River in a carefully staged public stunt, symbolizing vitality, courage, and the return of revolutionary energy. Newspapers splashed the photos across front pages. Propaganda organs declared the swim a metaphor for cleansing the nation. For millions of young people, the message was unmistakable. Mao had returned, and the revolution was beginning anew. Encouraged by Mao's call to bombard the headquarters, students formed the first Red Guard groups, youth militias that took it upon themselves to identify, attack, and purify society by eliminating bourgeois elements. They wore red armbands, carried the Little Red Book, and saw themselves as warriors of a new age. Crowds of students marched through Beijing, chanting slogans, waving banners, and demanding the destruction of anything associated with old culture, old customs, old ideas, or old habits. What started as political mobilization quickly became a mass movement beyond the state's control. Senior officials watched helplessly as the atmosphere shifted from tension to frenzy. School administrators, local cadres, and intellectuals were suddenly targets of student mobs who believed they were acting with Mao's blessing. The party's established hierarchy began to fracture. Authority no longer flowed through offices and committees, but through Mao's charisma, interpreted directly by the youth. China was entering a period of upheaval unlike anything it had experienced before. With the Cultural Revolution unleashed, Mao had regained the momentum he sought. Power was no longer concentrated in the hands of cautious bureaucrats. It now surged from the streets, fueled by the energy of millions of young people. And as this revolutionary tide swept across the country, the violence and chaos it carried would soon eclipse even the darkest chapters of the early Maoist era. When the Red Guard surged into the streets in the summer of 1966, China entered a fever dream of revolutionary zeal. Students who had spent their childhoods reciting Mao's words now believed they were chosen to purify the nation. Empowered by the chairman's blessing, they felt untouchable, warriors of ideology, answering directly to the highest authority in the land. In their eyes, school principals, librarians, factory supervisors, and even parents could become enemies of the revolution overnight. The first targets were teachers. Long respected for their learning, they suddenly became symbols of bourgeois intellectualism. Students dragged them onto stages, forced them to bow, and beat them with belts, bamboo sticks, or fists. Some educators, after decades of service, died under this violence, killed by the very students they once guided. The Red Guards saw these acts not as brutality, but as moral cleansing, necessary for dismantling the old world. As the movement escalated, attacks expanded to include local officials, shop owners, artists, and anyone accused of elitism or insufficient revolutionary fervor. Homes were searched without warrants, belongings confiscated or destroyed, and family heirlooms smashed in the name of eradicating old culture. Streets filled with chanting youth parading through neighborhoods, holding banners and brandishing the Little Red Book like a sacred weapon. Fear spread faster than the Red Guards' marches. People hid books, photos, and even memories that could be labeled counter-revolutionary. Public humiliation became a staple of daily life. Victims were forced to wear dunce caps, kneel on broken glass, or parade through streets with signs listing their alleged crimes. Some were tied up using painful methods like airplane posture, their arms pulled back until joints strained. Crowds gathered to shout insults, spit, or throw objects. The line between political ritual and cruelty vanished entirely. In many cities, rival Red Guard factions emerged, each claiming to represent the true spirit of Mao's revolution. These groups clashed violently, seizing campuses, street corners, and entire districts. Armed with clubs, homemade weapons, and occasionally stolen firearms, they fought battles that lasted hours or days. The Cultural Revolution was no longer an ideological campaign. It had become a fragmented civil war driven by teenage zealots. The destruction of cultural heritage reached catastrophic levels. Temples, ancestral halls, libraries, and museums were ransacked. Ancient statues were smashed, paintings burned, rare manuscripts torn apart. Entire centuries of Chinese civilization were erased in a matter of months. The Red Guards believed they were wiping away the past so that a new revolutionary culture could be born, but what emerged instead was a vast landscape of loss. By late 1966, chaos had spread beyond cities into rural towns, where local Red Guards conducted raids with even less restraint. Families who had lived peacefully for generations found themselves torn apart by denunciations and forced confessions. In some areas, mobs executed accused class enemies without oversight, leaving bodies in fields or rivers as grim warnings. The violence, once sporadic, now rippled outward through every corner of society. The Cultural Revolution had reached a point where the state could no longer pretend it controlled the movement. Mao had unleashed a force driven not by discipline but by unrestrained passion, and the Red Guards acted with a sense of destiny that overshadowed legality or morality. China was plunging into a dark season of ideological fervor, where the boundaries of right and wrong were measured only by proximity to Mao's will, and the cost in lives, culture, and stability would soon escalate even further. By early 1967, the Cultural Revolution had spiraled far beyond the stage of student rebellion. What began as ideological purification now fractured into violent competition for legitimacy and power. Red Guard factions split into rival groups, each claiming to be the true defenders of Mao's vision. Armed confrontations erupted across cities, turning campuses, factories, and entire neighborhoods into battlegrounds. The revolution had begun consuming its own children. As violence intensified, local governments collapsed under the weight of chaos. Some officials tried to maintain order, only to be denounced as capitalist roaders and dragged into struggle sessions. Others aligned themselves with competing Red Guard factions, plunging provinces into factional warfare. Administrative paralysis left millions without functioning public services. Trains stopped running, warehouses were looted, and food distribution networks faltered. China was drifting into anarchy under the banner of revolution. Mao and his inner circle initially allowed these clashes, believing that conflict would expose hidden enemies within the party. But soon, the scale of violence exceeded even their expectations. In cities like Wuhan and Chongqing, rival factions exchanged gunfire and seized government buildings. Entire districts became war zones with barricades, makeshift fortifications, and armed militias patrolling streets. The Cultural Revolution was no longer an ideological movement. It had become a nationwide civil conflict. Some of the most horrifying violence erupted in rural regions where local factionalism mixed with long-standing grievances. In Guangxi, massacres occurred on a massive scale, with entire villages targeted for extermination under accusations of counter-revolutionary lineage. In Inner Mongolia, tens of thousands were tortured or killed during purges aimed at eliminating alleged separatists. In Hunan's Dao County, mobs murdered families across generational lines, believing they were eradicating class enemies. These local horrors unfolded largely out of sight, leaving deep wounds that lingered long after the movement ended. As factional warfare intensified, Mao realized that the revolution he unleashed threatened to destabilize the entire country. Factories had shut down, transportation networks were collapsing, and famine risk was rising in several provinces. The party's senior leadership, terrified of losing national control, began to support direct intervention by the People's Liberation Army. Soldiers were deployed to pacify cities, suppress factions, and restore basic governance, often with brutal force. The PLA's entry marked a decisive shift. In some regions, soldiers fired on Red Guard units that refused to disarm. In others, they stormed occupied campuses, arresting ringleaders and ending street battles. The same students once praised as little generals were now labeled as reactionaries when they defied military authority. For many young people, the realization was devastating. The revolution they believed they were protecting had turned against them. High-level purges soon followed. Liu Shaoqi, the head of state and once Mao's closest comrade, was arrested, tortured, and left to die in secret confinement. His death symbolized the total collapse of the party's moderate wing. Deng Xiaoping, another senior leader, was denounced and sent to perform hard labor in the countryside. Across China, officials who had guided reconstruction after the Great Leap Forward were removed, humiliated, or imprisoned. Mao had reasserted dominance not through reasoned debate, but through the systematic destruction of his rivals. By 1968, the Cultural Revolution had transformed from a movement of youthful passion into a militarized purge orchestrated by the state. Red Guard factions were disbanded. Surviving students were told to go to the countryside, effectively exiling them from urban centers. China had survived the first storms of chaos, but the scars, physical, emotional, and institutional, ran deep, and the next stage of the revolution would push millions more into hardship under the guise of revolutionary purification. By 1968, China's cities were exhausted from years of chaos. Streets once filled with chanting Red Guards had become battlegrounds littered with debris, shuttered schools, and neighborhoods scarred by factional war. Factories struggled to function, universities sat abandoned, and entire administrations had collapsed under the weight of revolutionary turmoil. In the eyes of the party, the youth who once served as Mao's vanguard were now a destabilizing force, too numerous, too restless, and too ideologically volatile to remain in the cities. Mao's solution was both sweeping and devastatingly simple: remove them. Under the slogan, "Up to the mountains and down to the countryside," more than 17 million urban youths were ordered to leave their homes and relocate to remote rural areas. These young people, many barely in their teens, were told they would learn from the peasants, harden their revolutionary spirit, and cleanse themselves of urban bourgeois tendencies. In reality, it was a massive dispersal, designed to break up concentrations of disillusioned youth who might threaten the party's control. For many families, the day of departure was unforgettable. Parents met the order with grief they had to hide. Showing sorrow could be interpreted as political weakness. Train stations filled with young people carrying only a few belongings, waving goodbye through tears. Some had spent years marching in parades for Mao, only to now be shipped away in silence, uncertain if or when they would return. The state presented the movement as a noble mission, but the fear and confusion were palpable. Life in the countryside shattered urban illusions of revolutionary glory. Young people accustomed to city life found themselves in villages without electricity, paved roads, or adequate food. They performed backbreaking labor, clearing fields, cutting timber, hauling water, and tending animals from dawn to dusk. Many slept in crude sheds or shared cramped rooms with rural families equally wary of their presence. The hardship was not only physical, it was emotional, a slow realization that the revolution saw them as expendable. Isolation weighed heavily. Letters home took months to arrive, and travel was forbidden without official permission. Some youths lived hundreds of miles from the nearest city, lost among mountains or grasslands, where winter nights could reach lethal temperatures. Illnesses went untreated. Accidents during labor were common. In many regions, young women faced harassment or pressure to marry local men, their futures shaped by circumstances they never chose. The promise of learning from the peasants became a sentence of indefinite exile. Yet even in such harsh conditions, bonds formed. Youths created small communities of support, sharing stories of lost futures and hopes of returning home. Some tried to continue studying by candlelight, clinging to dreams of university despite knowing that political labels, not academic merit, would decide their fate. Others wrote journals or poems, documenting their experiences with a quiet bravery that would only be recognized decades later. But for most, the years in the countryside became a period of stagnation, a lost chapter of life. The Rustication movement also served a deeper political purpose. By scattering millions of young people across vast rural landscapes, the party ensured that no unified opposition could emerge from the generation that had once idolized Mao but now felt betrayed by the revolution's violent turns. Those who returned years later discovered that their sacrifices were barely acknowledged and that their futures remained limited by political labels they had no control over. When the policy finally subsided in the mid-1970s, it left behind a generation marked by disillusionment. These young people had marched enthusiastically into the revolution, only to be banished from the cities they called home. Their exile was not an accident of policy, but a deliberate act of control, an attempt to silence a generation already shaken by chaos. And while they returned with resilience forged from hardship, the emotional cost would linger for the rest of their lives. Hidden across China's vast frontiers, deep in forests, deserts, mines, and frozen borderlands, lay one of the most brutal components of Mao's terror, the Laogai, or reform through labor system. Modeled on the Soviet Gulag, yet expanded in scale, Laogai camps formed a parallel nation of prisoners, many condemned not by laws but by shifting political winds. Intellectuals labeled rightists, religious believers, so-called counter-revolutionaries, and countless innocents entered these camps with no trial and no clear end date. For the party, labor was not just punishment, it was a tool to break people, reshape them, and erase the society that existed before 1949. Life inside the Laogai stripped individuals of identity from the moment they arrived. Prisoners surrendered their names and became numbers lost among thousands of others. Days began before sunrise with forced marches to labor sites, mines, quarries, logging fields, or construction zones, where work continued until collapse. Food rations were so meager that prisoners often survived on grass, insects, and discarded scraps, their bodies withering under the combined weight of hunger and exhaustion. Conditions varied from harsh to lethal. In the coal mines of Shanxi and the forests of Heilongjiang, prisoners labored in temperatures that froze their breath and stiffened their limbs. Others were sent to arid northwestern regions where the sun scorched the earth and dust filled their lungs. Disease swept through overcrowded barracks, and injuries from labor or beatings rarely received medical care. Many who entered the Laogai never left. Those who did carried the physical and psychological scars for life. But Laogai was more than physical suffering. It was ideological reprogramming. Prisoners were forced to attend nightly sessions of self-criticism, memorize Maoist texts, and accuse one another to prove loyalty. Guards evaluated not only work performance but emotional expressions, punishing anyone who appeared negative or insufficiently enthusiastic. This relentless pressure aimed to dissolve resistance from within, making prisoners question their memories, their beliefs, and even their own identities. Terror did not stop at the camp gates. A person sentenced to the Laogai condemned their entire family to political stigma. Children of prisoners were often barred from good schools, excluded from the party, and denied urban residency. Relatives learned quickly that attempts to defend or contact loved ones could be interpreted as signs of sympathy for reactionaries. Fear radiated outward through generations, extending the reach of the camps far beyond the prisoners themselves. Despite the brutality, the Laogai system also served an economic purpose. Forced labor produced timber, coal, agricultural goods, and manufactured items that contributed quietly to the state economy. Some provinces relied heavily on prison labor for infrastructure projects, building roads, irrigation canals, and military facilities. The suffering of millions became an invisible engine sustaining Maoist industrialization. Estimates suggest that 20 to 27 million people passed through the Laogai during Mao's rule, with 1.5 to 3 million dying from starvation, illness, torture, or overwork. These numbers are conservative. The exact toll may never be known due to the secrecy surrounding the system. What is certain is that Laogai formed a hidden world of anguish, a place where human life was reduced to labor quotas and political utility. For survivors, the trauma endured long after release. Many returned home to find their families broken, their reputations destroyed, and their futures permanently narrowed by the political labels that had sent them to the camps in the first place. The Laogai did not merely imprison bodies, it reshaped society by instilling fear so deep that it persisted for generations. As Mao's terror machine continued into the final years of his rule, this network of camps stood as one of its most enduring and devastating pillars. By the late Maoist period, terror no longer relied primarily on executions, purges, or even labor camps. It had seeped into the private corners of life, into thoughts, emotions, and the silent calculations people made before speaking a single word. This was the deepest layer of Mao's system, the internalization of fear. People learned not only what they could say, but what they could think without risking their future or the safety of their families. Terror became psychological, woven into everyday habits that shaped an entire generation's understanding of reality. Propaganda formed the architecture of this mental world. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, school lessons, and posters all carried the same message. Mao was infallible. The party was benevolent, and enemies were everywhere. History was rewritten to match ideological needs. Victories were exaggerated, failures hidden or blamed on saboteurs. By saturating every public space with carefully curated truth, the state created an environment where unapproved ideas felt not only dangerous, but unnatural. At the heart of this system were the rituals of self-criticism and mutual criticism. In work units and schools, citizens gathered routinely to confess ideological errors, however small or imagined. A careless comment, an unenthusiastic reaction, or even a slightly hesitant expression could trigger accusations. People learned to criticize themselves with preemptive enthusiasm, hoping that by admitting fictitious faults, they could avoid more serious charges. The line between sincere reflection and coerced humiliation blurred until both became indistinguishable. The demand for denunciation corroded trust at every level of society. Neighbors monitored one another, co-workers whispered suspicions, even family members were pressured to report problematic thoughts. A child who overheard a parent's private complaint might mention it at school, believing they were acting patriotically, unaware that such a confession could destroy a family overnight. Under these conditions, affection and loyalty became liabilities. Silence was not only a survival strategy, it was the only safe language left. This psychological landscape affected millions who never experienced a struggle session or camp. Ordinary people lived in a constant state of watchfulness, editing their speech, moderating their emotions, and performing ideological devotion as instinctively as breathing. The fear of making a political mistake became a form of internalized discipline, far more effective than external coercion. When people begin policing their own thoughts, the state no longer needs to watch every move. They do the work themselves. The cumulative effect was a profound emotional narrowing. People learned not to dwell on questions without answers, not to remember events that contradicted official narratives, and not to voice grief for relatives lost to famine or struggle. Trauma was carried silently because sharing it risked political danger. Over time, collective memory fragmented, with stories whispered privately or buried completely. The nation functioned, but beneath the surface lay a vast undercurrent of unspoken pain. When Mao died in 1976, the infrastructure of terror did not collapse overnight. The scars of decades of fear lingered in workplaces, families, and the language people used to navigate life. Even after official condemnation of the Cultural Revolution, few dared discuss the true extent of suffering. Generations grew up with parents unable to articulate their past and children unable to ask. The silence became its own legacy. This final layer, the psychological reshaping of society, was perhaps Mao's most enduring form of control. It did not require guns or prisons, only the relentless pressure of ideology and the knowledge that the consequences of a single misstep could echo for years. The terror that began with executions and struggle sessions ended as something far more intimate, a reshaped human consciousness, conditioned to obey, to fear, and above all, to never forget the cost of speaking truth in a world ruled by silence. In the end, this history leaves us with a quiet truth. The deepest wounds are not carved into the body, but into the silence people learn to live with. If this story gave you something to reflect on, stay with us as we continue uncovering the truths buried beneath time.